The moment I opened the door to what I thought was my own guest cottage and found another woman's silk robe draped over my late mother's reading chair, I understood that every year I had spent building my husband's empire had been spent building a cage for myself. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to ask you something, because I think you already know the answer in your heart. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in hope, and in the quiet miracle of second chances, would you take a moment right now to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to our channel? Our community grows stronger every time someone chooses to believe that broken things can still be made whole, and I want you to be part of that with us. Now let me tell you how I found myself standing in that doorway, and what I did after. My name is Margaret Ashworth, though for 18 years I answered to Margaret Voss, and before that name meant heartbreak, it meant something like partnership, like purpose, like love. I met Julian Voss when I was 26 years old and working the front desk of a modest inn in the Cotswolds, the kind of place with uneven floors and a fireplace that smoked if the wind came from the wrong direction. Julian arrived one autumn evening with a suitcase full of ambition and almost nothing else. He had a dream of turning failing countryside properties into boutique hotels for wealthy travelers who wanted the illusion of rustic charm without sacrificing thread count. He talked for 3 hours over a pot of tea about vineyards in the Loire Valley and villas in Tuscany he intended to acquire, and I remember thinking that either this man was a fool or he was going to become something extraordinary. I did not yet understand that a person could be both at once. We married 18 months later in a small stone chapel near my childhood home, with my mother crying in the front pew and Julian's business partner serving as his only witness, because Julian's own family had scattered to the corners of the earth and rarely spoke to one another. I did not mind. I told myself that I was gaining a family in him, that whatever love and loyalty I had to give, I would give twice as hard since he had so little of his own. It is a particular kind of trap, believing that your love can fill in for someone else's absence. I built my entire identity around being enough for 2 people's worth of family, and Julian, for his part, let me believe it, because it served him well to have a wife who asked for nothing and gave everything. In the early years, the work was brutal and the money was thin. I learned to read architectural blueprints because we could not afford a project manager. I learned French and Italian well enough to negotiate with contractors and county officials, sitting up late with dictionaries and recordings while Julian slept, because he said he was better with vision and I was better with details. I did not resent this division of labor at the time. I believed we were a single organism with 2 functioning halves, and that his glory was mine as well, simply worn on a different set of shoulders. When our first restored property opened in Provence, a lavender-covered estate we had gutted and rebuilt with our own hands and borrowed money, I stood in the courtyard at sunset and wept, because I finally understood what my mother meant when she said that some kinds of exhaustion feel like joy. Over the following decade, the Voss collection, as Julian named it, grew from that single Provençal estate into 11 properties scattered across France, Italy, Portugal, and eventually Croatia. I was the one who negotiated with the notoriously difficult mayor of a hill town in Umbria to secure permits nobody thought we would get. I was the one who sat beside dying negotiations with Portuguese banks and turned them, through sheer stubborn charm, into approved loans. I learned to read balance sheets the way other women read novels, cover to cover, missing nothing. Julian would stand at the ribbon cuttings in his tailored linen suits, smiling for magazine photographers, and I would stand slightly behind him, in the shadow of the doorway I had personally chosen the hinges for, and I told myself that this was simply how it worked, that some people were meant to be the face and some were meant to be the foundation, and foundations do not need applause, foundations only need to hold. Somewhere in the middle of all that growth, I stopped noticing that Julian had begun speaking about the Voss collection as though it were entirely his own creation. In interviews he described himself as a self-made visionary, and I would read these articles curled on our sofa with a cup of tea going cold in my hands, waiting for the sentence where he mentioned me, and the sentence rarely came, and when it did, it was some variation of, and of course my wife has been wonderfully supportive, as though I had spent a decade being supportive the way a good armchair is supportive, rather than the way an architect is essential. I told myself it did not matter. I told myself that legacy was not about credit, it was about the work itself, about the lavender fields and the restored stone farmhouses and the Croatian coastline villa where local fishermen's grandchildren now had steady jobs because of what we, together, had built. I told myself many things during those years, most of them designed to help me sleep at night rather than to help me see clearly. The children we never had became a quiet grief I mostly kept to myself. We tried in the early years, before the business consumed every waking hour, and then we stopped trying without ever formally deciding to stop, the way a river changes course not through any single dramatic event but through 1,000 small erosions. Julian said, more than once, that the properties were our children, that we had built something that would outlast any biological legacy, and I nodded because it was easier than arguing, though some nights I would drive past a village schoolyard and have to pull the car over because my chest had become too tight to breathe through. I never told Julian about those nights. I had learned, without quite realizing when the lesson took hold, that my grief was an inconvenience to a man building an empire, and so I folded it small and put it somewhere out of sight, the way you might fold away a wedding dress you know you will never wear again but cannot bring yourself to throw out. The property in Provence held a special place in both our hearts, or so I believed, because it was the first, because we had slept on the floor of its unfinished kitchen wrapped in a single blanket during a February cold snap, because it represented everything we had built from nothing. 3 years ago, Julian suggested we convert a small guest cottage on the grounds, tucked behind an old olive grove, into what he called a private retreat, somewhere separate from the working hotel where we could escape when the main house grew too busy with guests and staff. I loved the idea. I decorated it myself, choosing linen curtains the color of unbleached wheat, finding my late mother's reading chair in an antique shop in Avignon and having it reupholstered in a soft moss green that reminded me of her garden. I hung photographs of our early years there, black and white pictures of the two of us covered in plaster dust, laughing in a way I realized, looking back, we had not laughed together in years. That cottage became, in my mind, the one place in our sprawling empire that belonged purely to us, untouched by investors or magazine photographers or the endless machinery of growth. Julian began spending more time there alone over the past year, telling me he needed quiet space to think through expansion plans for a new acquisition in the Algarve. I believed him completely, because I had spent 18 years believing him completely, because doubt had never been given room to grow in the garden of our marriage, not because I was naive but because I had built my entire self around the practice of trust the way I had built our properties, brick by careful brick, and I did not know how to begin dismantling something I had spent so long constructing. Looking back now, I can see the small signs I chose not to examine too closely, the way he began locking his phone with a passcode he had never used before, the way he started taking business calls on the terrace with the doors closed, the faint perfume that lingered in his linen jackets that was not the cedar and bergamot cologne I had bought him every Christmas for a decade. I noticed these things the way you notice a single crack in a foundation wall, telling yourself it is only settling, only the natural aging of something old, nothing that requires the difficult and frightening work of looking closer. The day everything broke open began ordinarily enough, under a bright Provençal sky with the kind of golden late-morning light that made the lavender fields look like something from a painting. I had flown in a day earlier than planned from a meeting with our Croatian property managers, wanting to surprise Julian, wanting, if I am honest with myself now, to recapture some small piece of the romance that had quietly gone missing from our marriage over the past several years. I remember standing in the courtyard of the main house, breathing in the scent of rosemary and warm stone, feeling something like hope for the first time in longer than I could easily admit. I decided to walk down the gravel path through the olive grove to surprise him at the cottage, imagining his face when he saw me, imagining that we might spend the afternoon the way we used to, simply existing together without an agenda, without a deal to close or a contractor to manage. The cottage door was unlocked, which did not alarm me, because Julian was often careless about such things when he believed himself alone on our own private property. What alarmed me was the sound of laughter coming from inside, low and warm and entirely unfamiliar, a woman's laughter threading through the quiet morning air like a wire pulled taut across my chest. I stood on the threshold for a long moment before I pushed the door open, and I want you to understand that in that single moment, some small merciful part of my mind was still constructing innocent explanations, a business partner, a decorator, anyone at all who might explain away what I was about to see. What I saw instead was a woman perhaps 10 years younger than myself, with dark hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a silk robe I did not recognize, standing in my kitchen pouring coffee from a pot that had been a wedding gift from my own sister. She turned when she heard the door, and her expression shifted from startled to something far worse, a kind of weary resignation, as though she had long known this moment was coming and had simply been waiting to see what shape it would take. Julian came around the corner from the bedroom at that exact moment, shirtless, a towel around his neck, and the three of us stood frozen in a tableau so absurd and so devastating that for several seconds I genuinely believed I might be dreaming, that my mind had simply constructed the worst possible scenario as some kind of cruel test I would soon wake from. I did not scream. I want to tell you that, because I think there is a particular kind of dignity that survives even the worst betrayals, and I found mine in that moment, standing very still in the doorway of the cottage I had decorated with my mother's chair and our early photographs, looking at my husband of 18 years and the woman who had apparently been living in the private sanctuary I believed belonged only to us. I asked, in a voice that came out far steadier than I felt, how long this had been going on, and Julian, to his eternal shame, did not even have the decency to look ashamed. He said her name was Corinne, as though an introduction might somehow soften what I was witnessing, as though the social ritual of naming could paper over the wreckage. He said they had been involved for over a year, that she had moved into the cottage 6 months ago because he had grown tired of hotels during his frequent trips to oversee the Algarve project, that he had been meaning to talk to me but had never found the right time. I asked him, and I remember my voice cracking on this single question in a way it had not cracked on any of the others, whether Corinne knew that this cottage held my mother's chair, whether she had sat in it, whether she understood what that chair meant, and Julian looked at me with an expression of genuine confusion, as though I had asked something entirely beside the point, and in that confusion I understood something that took my breath away more completely than the affair itself. He had never truly seen me. Not the version of me that mattered, not the woman who had spent 18 years pouring her intelligence and her labor and her heart into building something she believed was theirs together. He had seen a useful partner, a capable manager, perhaps even someone he was genuinely fond of in his own limited way, but he had never seen the full and complicated person standing before him, the one who grieved children she never had, who kept her mother's chair as a small shrine to unconditional love, who had built an empire with her own 2 hands and received none of the credit and apparently very little of the loyalty. I did not stay to hear more explanations. I turned and walked back through the olive grove, and I want to tell you honestly that I do not remember the walk itself, only that I arrived at the main house and found myself sitting on the edge of the enormous bed in the master suite we shared, staring at nothing, for what might have been minutes or might have been hours. Eventually our longtime housekeeper, a warm and perceptive woman named Delphine who had worked for us since the earliest days of the Provence property, found me there and, without asking a single question, simply sat beside me and held my hand until I could speak again. Delphine had watched me build this empire from the very beginning. She had seen the version of me that negotiated with difficult contractors and stayed up until 3 in the morning solving supply chain problems and personally scrubbed floors when we were too broke to hire help. When I finally told her what I had found in the cottage, she did not gasp or perform shock for my benefit. She simply nodded slowly, and said that she had suspected something was wrong for months but had not known how to say it to me without seeming to overstep, and this small confirmation, that others had seen what I had refused to see, was almost harder to bear than the affair itself. The days that followed passed in a strange fog of practical necessity and emotional devastation existing side by side. I did not scream at Julian again, though I had every right to. Instead, I found a peculiar clarity settling over me, the same kind of clarity I had relied on for nearly 2 decades when solving a business crisis, except now the crisis was my own life. I contacted a lawyer in Aix-en-Provence, a sharp and compassionate woman named Isabelle Renard who specialized in complex cross-border business dissolutions, because our marriage and our business had become so thoroughly intertwined over 18 years that separating them would require the kind of surgical precision usually reserved for organ transplants. Isabelle listened to my story without judgment, and when I finished, she said something I have carried with me ever since, that the law could help me reclaim what was rightfully mine, but only I could decide what I wanted to build with whatever remained. Julian, for his part, oscillated wildly during those first weeks between defensive anger and desperate pleading, sometimes within the same conversation. He told me at one point that Corinne meant nothing, that it had simply happened, as though infidelity were a kind of weather system that descended upon a person without warning or agency. At another point he told me that I had grown distant over the years, too consumed by spreadsheets and contractors, as though the labor I had performed on behalf of our shared dream was somehow the cause of its betrayal rather than its very foundation. I listened to these explanations with a strange detachment, cataloging them the way I might catalog a contractor's excuses for shoddy work, and I found that none of them moved me, because I had already begun the slow and painful process of understanding that his betrayal was not something that had happened to our marriage from the outside, but something that had been growing quietly within it for years, nourished by every unacknowledged sacrifice and every uncredited achievement I had allowed to pass without protest. What surprised me most, in the weeks that followed, was not my grief, which was real and enormous and sat on my chest like a stone I carried everywhere I went, but the unexpected clarity that emerged alongside it. I began, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, to ask myself what I actually wanted, separate from what Julian wanted, separate from the momentum of an empire we had built together. I realized, sitting alone in the main house one bright afternoon while lawyers exchanged documents in the background, that I loved the actual work, the restoration of old stone buildings, the careful negotiation with local craftsmen who understood their trade better than any consultant, the slow transformation of neglect into beauty. I did not love the version of that work that had required me to disappear into Julian's shadow. This realization did not erase my pain, but it gave the pain a shape I could work with, rather than an endless formless grief that threatened to swallow me whole. Isabel and I spent the following months untangling nearly 2 decades of shared business interests, and it was grueling, exhausting work that required me to review every property, every contract, every investment with an unflinching eye. Julian's lawyers pushed hard, arguing that his vision had been the driving force of the Voss collection and that my role had been primarily supportive, and I want to tell you that hearing this argument articulated formally, in cold legal language, hurt in a way I had not expected, because it confirmed that the diminishment I had felt for years was not merely my own insecurity but an actual belief held by the man I had married. But I had spent 18 years accumulating evidence of my own contributions without ever realizing I was building a case, and Isabel and I assembled it methodically. The correspondence in my own hand negotiating permits in 3 languages, the architectural revisions bearing my initials, the financial records showing which of us had personally guaranteed loans during the leanest years, the testimonials from contractors and local officials who remembered, with total clarity, who had actually been present on site solving problems while Julian gave interviews in Paris and Milan. During this period, I also learned something about Corinne that shifted my understanding of the entire situation in a way I had not anticipated. Delphine, who maintained relationships with staff across all our properties, mentioned to me one afternoon that Corinne had once worked as an event coordinator for a competing hospitality group, and that she had approached Julian originally through what appeared to be a legitimate business consultation before the relationship became something else entirely. I did not seek this information out of a desire for vengeance, though I would understand if you assumed as much. I sought it because I needed to understand the full shape of what had happened to me, and in understanding it, I found something unexpected, a flicker of compassion for a woman who had perhaps been drawn into a situation with a man skilled at making others feel singularly important, a skill I knew intimately because I had spent 18 years on the receiving end of it myself, back when it had felt like devotion rather than strategy. I do not excuse what Corinne did. Choosing to build a life inside someone else's marriage, inside someone else's home, using someone else's family heirlooms, is its own kind of harm that deserves acknowledgement. But I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that my deepest anger settled on Julian, the man who had made 2 women feel simultaneously essential and disposable, rather than on a woman who had likely been fed the same carefully constructed narrative of loneliness and misunderstanding that had once worked so effectively on me. The settlement negotiations dragged through the better part of a year, punctuated by moments of such profound sadness that I sometimes found myself unable to leave my bed before noon, and other moments of surprising strength that felt almost like discovering a muscle I had not known I possessed. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think this is the moment in the story where the lesson begins to reveal itself, and I would love to know your thoughts. Have you ever discovered, in the midst of your own heartbreak, a strength you did not know you carried? I would be so grateful if you shared that in the comments below, because these stories we tell each other are how we remind one another that we are not alone in the hardest chapters of our lives. The turning point in the legal proceedings came when a forensic accountant hired by my legal team uncovered something neither Isabel nor I had anticipated. Julian had been quietly diverting funds from the Voss Collection's operating accounts into a separate holding company over the previous 2 years, funds that appeared to have financed not only Kern's living arrangements but also a planned expansion into the Algarve that he had never formally disclosed to our joint board of investors, several of whom were old friends of mine from the early days who had trusted us both with significant capital. This discovery transformed the nature of the proceedings entirely, because it was no longer simply a matter of dividing marital assets fairly, it was a matter of financial misconduct that put the entire Voss collection, including the livelihoods of the hundreds of staff members across 11 properties who depended on it, at genuine risk. I remember the exact moment I understood the full weight of what this meant, sitting in Isabel's office in Aix-en-Provence with the afternoon light slanting through tall windows, watching dust motes drift through the air while she explained the implications in her calm, measured voice. I could pursue this aggressively, potentially resulting in Julian facing serious legal consequences and losing control of the company entirely, or I could use this leverage to negotiate a settlement that would give me controlling interest in the properties I had personally built while allowing Julian to retreat quietly with a diminished but still comfortable stake. Isabel told me, with the particular gentleness of someone who had guided many people through similarly impossible choices, that there was no wrong answer here, only the answer that would let me sleep at night for the rest of my life. I thought, in that moment, about Delphine, who had worked for us for 15 years and had 2 children in the local school. I thought about Marcus, the vineyard manager in Provence who had taught himself English specifically so he could better communicate with the international guests we hosted, and who had once driven 3 hours in the middle of the night to fix a burst pipe rather than let a wedding party wake to a flooded ballroom. I thought about the hundreds of other people whose lives had become quietly woven into the empire I had built, people who had nothing to do with Julian's betrayal and everything to do with the actual soul of what we had created together. I decided, sitting in that office, that I did not want revenge if revenge meant collateral damage to people who had trusted us. I wanted, instead, what was rightfully mine, both in terms of ownership and in terms of recognition, and I wanted the opportunity to prove that everything worth preserving about the Voss collection had been built by hands that understood its true value. The negotiated settlement that emerged over the following weeks gave me controlling ownership of 7 of our 11 properties, including the original estate in Provence where everything had begun, along with a formal acknowledgement, embedded in the dissolution agreement itself, of my role as co-founder rather than merely a supportive spouse. Julian retained the remaining 4 properties, including the still unfinished Algarve project, along with a stern warning from the joint board of investors that any further financial irregularities would result in immediate legal action. He did not fight this outcome as hard as I expected him to, and I have wondered since whether some small remaining part of him understood, even through his own self-interest and rationalization, that he was receiving more mercy than the situation strictly required. I want to tell you about the day the papers were finalized, because it did not feel like the triumphant conclusion you might expect from a story like this one. I sat alone that evening on the terrace of the Provence estate, watching the sun set over the lavender fields that had been the first thing Julian and I ever built together, and I felt not victory but a profound and complicated grief, the grief of mourning a marriage that had once been real, even if it had also been unequal, even if it had eventually become something that no longer deserved to be called a marriage at all. I allowed myself to cry that night in a way I had not fully permitted myself during the long months of legal proceedings, when I had needed to remain sharp and strategic. I cried for the 26-year-old woman who had believed, with such complete and generous faith, that her love could be enough to fill in every gap in another person's damaged heart. I cried for the 18 years of labor that had been quietly erased from every magazine profile and every ribbon-cutting photograph. But I also, somewhere in that same long evening, began to feel something unexpected stirring beneath the grief, something that felt almost like relief, the particular relief of finally setting down a weight you had carried for so long you had forgotten it was possible to walk without it. In the months that followed, I threw myself into the properties that were now fully and legally mine, and I discovered, to my genuine surprise, that the work felt entirely different when I was building something for myself rather than building something for someone else's legacy. I renamed the collection, not out of spite but out of a desire to finally claim the achievement as my own, choosing the name Ashworth Estates, my mother's maiden name, as a quiet tribute to the woman whose reading chair had sat in that cottage and whose steady, unglamorous love had taught me what real devotion actually looked like. I redesigned the cottage entirely, stripping away every trace of what had happened there, and turned it instead into a small library and reading room for staff and their families, filling it with books in 5 languages and comfortable chairs, because I wanted that space to be reclaimed for something generous rather than left to fester as a monument to betrayal. Delphine, whose quiet loyalty had sustained me through the darkest weeks, became something closer to a true partner in the business, and I promoted her to general manager of the Provence estate, a position she filled with such natural grace that I sometimes wondered how I had ever managed without her formal authority to match her informal wisdom. Marcus, the vineyard manager, helped me develop a small line of estate wines under the Ashworth label, and the first bottling, released the following autumn, sold out within weeks, not because of any celebrity association but because word had spread through the local community about the woman who had rebuilt her life and her business with her own 2 hands after being betrayed by the man everyone had assumed deserved all the credit. I would love to know, if you have made it this far in our story together, whether you have ever had to rebuild something from what felt like ruins, whether professionally or personally, and what that rebuilding taught you about your own strength. Please leave a comment below sharing your experience, because I read every single one, and I have found so much comfort in hearing how many of you have walked through your own versions of this fire and emerged, perhaps slower and more careful, but undeniably stronger on the other side. The most unexpected turn in this story came nearly 2 years after that terrible morning in the cottage, when I received a letter, an actual handwritten letter, from Corinne. I almost did not open it, and I understand if you would have made the same choice, but something in me, some quiet curiosity about the fuller shape of what had happened to my life, made me sit down at my kitchen table and read it through twice. She wrote that she had left Julian 8 months earlier, after discovering that he had begun a similar pattern of secrecy and deception with yet another woman, a wine distributor he had met during negotiations for a new property in Croatia. She wrote that she understood I owed her nothing, not forgiveness, not even acknowledgement, but that she had spent many months in therapy coming to understand the particular vulnerability that had made her susceptible to a man like Julian, having grown up with a father who had similarly made her feel that love was something you earned through being endlessly accommodating and endlessly available. She apologized, simply and without excuse, for the pain she had caused me, and she said that she hoped, whatever I decided to do with her letter, that I had found some measure of peace. I sat with that letter for several days before deciding how to respond, and I want to be honest that my first instinct was anger, a fresh wave of it, because reading her words made the entire betrayal feel suddenly present again in a way I thought I had moved past. But as the days passed, I found myself thinking less about my own anger and more about the strange and sorrowful symmetry between her story and mine, 2 women who had each believed, at different points in the same man's life, that they were uniquely essential to him, only to discover that his capacity for making people feel that way was itself the mechanism of harm. I eventually wrote back, a short letter, telling her that I forgave her, not because what she had done was acceptable, but because I had learned, through my own long and difficult journey, that carrying unforgiveness is its own kind of prison, and I had already spent too many years of my life imprisoned by things outside my control. I told her I hoped she found the kind of love that did not require her to disappear into someone else's shadow, and I meant it with my whole heart. I did not hear from Julian directly very often after the settlement was finalized, though occasional news reached me through mutual acquaintances in the hospitality industry, a small and gossipy world where reputations travel quickly. I learned that the Algarve project had struggled without the operational expertise I had once quietly provided, that 2 of his remaining 4 properties had changed management within the first year under his sole ownership, and that his reputation among investors had grown noticeably more cautious. I did not take pleasure in this news the way I might have expected to during the darkest weeks of our separation. Instead, I felt something closer to a distant and almost maternal sadness, the recognition that a person who had once been capable of real partnership had chosen a path that led him further and further from the kind of genuine connection that might have actually sustained him. The true turning point of my own healing, the moment I can point to and say that is when I finally became someone new rather than simply a wounded version of who I had been, came during the third spring after the divorce, when I traveled alone to the Croatian coastal property to oversee renovations on what had once been a modest fisherman's cottage we had acquired years earlier. I stood on a rocky outcropping overlooking the Adriatic, the water so impossibly blue it seemed almost artificial, and I found myself laughing, genuinely and unexpectedly laughing, at nothing in particular, simply at the sensation of being fully present in my own life for the first time in longer than I could remember. I realized, standing there in the salt air with my hair whipping loose around my face, that I had spent 18 years building an empire in service of someone else's vision, and I had spent the 2 years since then rebuilding that same empire in service of my own healing, but I had not yet, until that exact moment, simply existed for the sheer joy of existing, without any project or purpose attached to the feeling at all. That trip to Croatia became a kind of quiet pilgrimage for me, and I extended my stay by several weeks beyond what business required. I began taking long walks along the coastline in the mornings before the heat of the day set in, and on one of these walks I met a man named Thomas Whitfield, an English marine biologist who had relocated to the Croatian coast several years earlier to study the region's declining fish populations and had fallen so thoroughly in love with the place that he had never quite managed to leave. We fell into conversation on the rocky path above the harbor, initially about nothing more significant than the unusual formation of the coastline, and I found myself, for the first time in years, simply enjoying a conversation for its own sake, without any awareness of strategy or performance, without the exhausting vigilance I had not even realized I still carried from my marriage to Julian. I do not want to suggest that Thomas arrived in my life as some kind of storybook rescue, because I had already done the difficult work of rescuing myself long before I met him, and I think that distinction matters enormously. What Thomas offered was not salvation but companionship, the particular gift of being genuinely curious about my full self, including the parts of my history that had nothing to do with hotels or vineyards or empires. He asked me questions about my childhood, about my mother, about the books I loved and the small ordinary pleasures that had nothing to do with my professional accomplishments, and I found myself, somewhat to my own astonishment, telling him things I had not spoken aloud in years, including the quiet grief of the children I never had, a subject I had kept folded away for nearly 2 decades. He did not try to fix that grief or offer easy comfort. He simply listened, with the kind of patient attention that felt like its own form of love, and something in me that had been braced and guarded for so long began, slowly and carefully, to soften. Our relationship developed gradually over the following year, unhurried in a way that felt entirely appropriate given everything I had survived, and Thomas eventually relocated to spend more time near the Provence estate, continuing his research remotely while I ran what had become a genuinely thriving collection of properties under the Ashworth name. I want to be clear that I did not need Thomas to complete my story, and I think it is important for anyone listening who has walked through their own betrayal to understand that a new relationship is never the actual proof of healing, the healing itself is the proof, and everything else is simply the fortunate result of having done that harder internal work first. But I will say that having someone in my life who saw me clearly, who understood both my strength and my softness without demanding that I diminish either one, was a gift I had not fully believed myself capable of receiving until I actually experienced it. 3 years after that terrible morning in the cottage, I hosted a small gathering at the Provence estate to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the property's original opening, though the celebration had grown to encompass so much more than a single building's history. Delphine organized the event with characteristic precision, and Marcus brought out several bottles from our first successful vintage of estate wine. I stood in the same courtyard where I had once wept with joy and exhaustion in the earliest days of building this dream, surrounded now by staff members who had become something like family, by Thomas, who watched me from across the courtyard with an expression of quiet pride that felt entirely different from the performative admiration I had once mistaken for love, and I felt something settle in my chest that I can only describe as peace, the genuine and hard-won kind that comes only after you have walked through real fire and emerged carrying its lessons rather than merely its scars. I think often about what I would say to the woman I was on that terrible morning, standing frozen in the doorway of the cottage, watching her entire understanding of her own life crumble in real time. I would tell her that the pain she was about to endure was real and would not be quick to pass, but that it would eventually reveal itself as a door rather than a wall, a painful but necessary passage into a life more fully and honestly her own than anything she had built while trying to be enough for two people simultaneously. I would tell her that the empire she had spent 18 years constructing had never actually belonged to the man whose name it carried, it had belonged to her own hands and her own relentless dedication all along, and that reclaiming that truth, however devastating the circumstances that forced the reclamation, would ultimately prove to be the greatest gift she ever gave herself. If this story has touched something in you, if you have ever poured yourself so completely into building someone else's dream that you forgot to ask what your own dream might look like, I would be so grateful if you would leave a comment sharing the lesson or the emotion that resonated most deeply with you, because these stories only become truly meaningful when we share them with one another and remind each other that we are not walking through our hardest chapters alone. Please also take a moment to like this video, share it with someone in your life who might need to hear a message of hope today, and subscribe to our channel so that you never miss another one of these emotional journeys we take together as a community that believes, above all else, in the possibility of second chances. I am 51 years old now, and I run a collection of properties across 4 countries that I built with my own hands, first in service of a marriage that ultimately proved unequal to the love I offered it, and later in service of my own hard-won understanding of what I am truly worth. I share my life now with a man who sees me completely, who has never once made me feel that my strength should be hidden in order to make room for his own. I have made peace, however imperfect and ongoing that peace remains, with a woman who once wore my history like a costume in a cottage that was supposed to be my sanctuary, because I learned that forgiveness is not a gift we give to those who wronged us, it is a gift we give to our own future, freeing ourselves from the weight of carrying someone else's failures forward through the rest of our lives. And I have learned, more than anything else, that an empire built on one person's silent sacrifice is never truly stable, no matter how impressive its architecture appears from the outside, but a life rebuilt on the foundation of one's own claimed worth can weather almost any storm that comes after. If you take nothing else from my story, I hope you take this: whatever you have built with your own hands, whatever quiet sacrifices you have made in service of someone else's vision, you deserve to stand fully in the light of that achievement, and it is never too late, no matter how many years have passed, to reclaim the life and the recognition that has always rightfully been yours.